All right, well, thank you, Adrian, for the kind introduction and also the kind invitation to come here and speak with you all and meet with you all. It's great, the stuff that's going on in the Melbourne community and in Australia in general, and behavioral economics, and of course on the behavioral policy side also there's a lot going on here, so it's great to have an invitation to meet some new people and share some things that I'm doing. Most of the work I've done in my career has focused on decision making under uncertainty from a behavioral economics, cognitive psychology perspective. More recently, and I guess this happens as people get older in their career, I've been interested in trying to do more good in the world outside the laboratory and outside our narrow community of scholars, and I've moved into doing some work in the domain of behavioral policy in particular, as Adrian alluded to. And what I'm going to share with you today is a very kind of rough and new perspective on this area of enterprise called choice architecture, which is a term that's attributed to Thaler and Sunstein that they introduced in their book Nudge in 2008. Which those of you who are interested in behavioral policy, I hope will be helpful. Those of you who are interested on the research side as well, I think hopefully it'll be interesting. But I'm now in the process of writing up a paper with a current postdoc, Job Kreinen, and a former postdoc, David Tannenbaum, on this very topic. So any feedback I get will be actually quite useful to us. It's still a work in progress. So for those of you who don't know what choice architecture is, let me give you a little bit of maybe a perspective on the neoclassical versus the behavioral perspective to doing policy making. The neoclassical perspective, the traditional perspective to policy making, assumes that each individual, targeted individual or agent or organization, is a member of a rarefied species that we sometimes refer to as Homo economicus, or economic man, economic person, somebody who is kind of robot-like in their ability to make decisions and judgments. They tend to be adept at maximizing their self-interest in a consistent way. They've got good memory, good information processing capacity. They tend to be maximizers. If you have that view of agents, then as a policymaker, you have primarily three tools at your disposal for implementing policy. The first is, of course, you can use monetary incentives to incentivize the kind of behavior that you want. You can use, from a government perspective, I suppose you could use tax subsidies, you could use penalties, that sort of thing. Secondly, you can use information or education. You inform agents of what good behavior is, what they ought to be doing, and you assume that they'll follow their best interests in pursuing, for instance, attractive programs that are in their best interests to follow, to behave in accordance with good suggestions for behavior. And then finally, you have regulation. You can tell people or companies what they can do, what they can't do. An economist would say that this is another form of incentive in a way, because if you back that up with some sort of enforcement, legal sanctions, threat of jail time or whatever, then that's really the mechanism behind it. But it sometimes is useful to separate between these three levels. Now, we know from decades of behavioral research that the representative individual doesn't quite really, in practice, look like Homo economicus. In fact, there's some recent brain imaging studies at UCLA where they found a more representative individual looks more like this, a member of a species we might refer to as Homo economicus, if you will, that we're just not quite as adept as that Olympian model of rationality would have you believe. We tend to have limitations in our memory, our attention, our information processing capacity that lead us to use mental shortcuts or heuristics to process information, for instance. We tend to be more interested not only in financial incentives, but there are other social incentives. We're social animals who interact with one another. We behave in systematically and predictably different ways than the Homo economicus model would have you believe. And as a result, we actually have an expanded toolkit at our disposal as policymakers, whether it's in a government context or an organizational context, if we want to influence behavior. Not only these tried and true methods, which certainly do work, but also an expanded toolkit that includes not just monetary incentives, but behavioral incentives that might be influenced by, for those of you who know it, prospect theory. We know that, for instance, people are more responsive to potential losses than foregone gains. They tend to overweight low probabilities, so lottery kinds of incentives can be useful, and so forth. But also social incentives, to belong, to feel like we're adhering to certain norms of correct behavior, and so forth. In terms of information and education, well, on the information side, it's not just the content of the information that matters, but the framing of it in terms of, for instance, losses versus gains can make a difference in people's behavior. We know that the format, the metrics that you communicate to people can make a big difference. For instance, Rick Larrick and Jack Saul at Duke University found that if you present auto mileage in a miles per gallon metric, which we do in the United States, people make bad decisions compared to if you invert it into a gallons consumed per, say, 100 miles. So format matters in terms of people's ability to process the information properly and make good decisions. Frequency of feedback can make a difference, or timing of feedback can make a difference if you're trying to use information to influence behavior and so forth. And then finally, and this is the centerpiece of Thaler and Sunstein's book, we don't necessarily have to resort to a strict form of paternalism that regulation implies, but we can be a little bit more soft in our touches that we use, a little more libertarian, but also, well, a little more subtle in the way in which we try and get people to behave the way we would like them to, using what they call nudges, which are interventions that don't appreciably change the financial incentives or the information provided, but do kind of lead people along the garden path, making it easier or more fun or more appealing in some way to behave in the way that we'd like them to, or perhaps introducing frictions against the behavior that we don't want. And I'll give some examples of these as I go on in my talk, but this sort of traditional approach, the traditional behavioral approach since 2008, as a behavioral person interested in behavioral policy, the traditional approach towards behavioral policy involves setting up what we call choice architectures. Thinking carefully about how we set up the choice set or the information set or the way in which people choose, decide, indicate the actions that they prefer in ways that guide them towards what is in society's best interests or the organization's best interests or hopefully their own best interests. Choice architecture 1.0, the original version as I would characterize it, again begins with the assumption that actors are in fact not necessarily rational and that preferences are constructed based in part on cues that they get from the choice architecture, how the information is presented to them, how we elicit their preferences and so forth. And choice architects can design an environment to promote better decisions while preserving freedom of choice. Okay, so that's the traditional approach. And it's been very fruitful so far, but I'd like to introduce to you, to motivate what I'm going to call choice architecture 2.0, 3 puzzles that are out there in the literature for a traditional choice architecture 1.0 framework. The first one involves 401k enrollment decisions, that's retirement savings enrollment decisions. The second involves antibiotic prescriptions and some work that we've done, and the third involves organ donations. So one of the most famous examples of choice architecture that's been done so far has been by my colleagues Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler, who's at the University of Chicago. They introduced years ago something they called the Save More Tomorrow program, or SMART program. What they did was they went into companies and they had some employees who had declined the traditional savings plan for retirement were invited to pre-commit to increasing their savings rates by 3% every time they received a pay raise in the future. And this was remarkably successful. The first time they ran it, employees offered the plan increased their saving rates on average from 3.5% of their income to 13.6% of their income over the study period. Just an absolute remarkable success. Its success is traditionally attributed to 2 primary behavioral sources. One is that the belt tightening, the sacrifice that you need to make, is in the future. And we know that people are very present focused. They tend to discount the future pretty severely relative to the present. And so it's easier to get people to commit to taking home less of their pay in the future than it is right now. Secondly, you're not really imposing losses on people because those increases in savings coincide with pay raises. So it's a foregone gain rather than a loss. Instead of taking home a little extra pay, I give up that. That's easier than actually reducing the amount of take-home pay. With that in mind, recently some researchers, David Brashears, Heng-Chen Dai, Katie Milkman, and Shlomo Benartzi, did a study where they thought, okay, well, let's put this to work, but we'll add some twists to it to maybe enhance the program. And so they sent mailings to a large number of employees at some U.S. universities, and they encouraged them to increase their savings using a simple form where there was either no delay, save now, there's a standard delay, in a particular time in the future, or a frame delay that I'm going to show you in a moment. So this is the no delay condition. Enroll me now in this savings plan. Then they had some standard delays. They thought, okay, save more tomorrow, where tomorrow is in 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, and so forth. So this is the standard delay format. I'm not going to distinguish between the point and time, but just know that it's in the future. And I mean, what they were interested in was, does it matter if you frame the delay by adding to it some sort of meaningful event like New Year's or your birthday or something like that, which is a topic that Katie Milkman and Hein Chendai have been studying. That part is irrelevant for our purposes today, because what I want to show you is the result. And the result is what happens to average contributions in the no delay versus the standard delay. And this is a puzzle. Contrary to the Save More Tomorrow result, which worked very robustly in a number of organizations, here in this field study what they found was, and this is real money, it turns out in fact that in the standard delay conditions, savings went down. Actually, the frame delay went down as well. So why is that? Why would Save More Tomorrow not work in this context? What's different? There's going to be one puzzle I'm going to just leave there for now. A second puzzle has to do with antibiotic prescription, and this is partly a shameless excuse to plug some research I've done on this topic, but partly it's quite central and relevant to the overarching theme I want to spin today. This is something that got me quite interested in applying behavioral insights to policy recently, was the problem of the rise of superbugs. Superbugs, which are antibiotic-resistant bacteria, kill approximately 50,000 people per year in the United States and Europe right now. It's estimated that if aggressive policy interventions aren't taken, that by 2050, as many as 10 million people a year could be killed worldwide due to antibiotics-resistant bacteria. One person every 3 seconds, I think that is. So this is a pretty serious problem. And a major cause of antibiotic resistance, well, about half of it is putting antibiotics in animal feed, which we really need to stop doing so much. But about half the problem has been attributed to overprescription of antibiotics. In the United States, if you go to a healthcare provider and you've got a cold, maybe you've got a cough or something like that, patients come in, they really would like to get something for their time and effort and money, and oftentimes they ask for antibiotics. But if it's not a bacterial infection, if it's a viral infection like bronchitis, then not only are the antibiotics not going to be helpful, in fact, they can contribute to the evolution of these antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So it's a real public goods problem, a real problem for the collective, that antibiotics tend to be overprescribed. In fact, the Centers for Disease Control at the United States estimates that about half the time when patients come in an outpatient context in the United States and they get antibiotics, they don't actually need them. This got the attention of the Obama White House, and in a national action plan for combating antibiotic resistant bacteria that came out in 2015, the very first part of their plan, they wanted to improve antibiotic stewardship, in particular by reducing inappropriate antibiotic use by 50% by the year 2020. I think he had in mind a different president of the United States would follow him and continue on this, but we'll leave that. So I was approached by a wonderful team of researchers at USC, RAND, Harvard, and Northwestern University, where we had an opportunity to do a behavioral intervention involving 248 clinicians, as you can see, in 47 practices across the country over an 18-month period. And we thought long and hard about some behavioral interventions that might work. The first one I'll describe briefly as suggested alternatives. If an acute respiratory infection was diagnosed, this triggered an alert in the electronic health record system, which is becoming increasingly ubiquitous across the United States now for facilitating the recording of medical information and prescribing drugs and so forth. Anyway, it would trigger an alert that would suggest alternatives, alternative treatments, including alternative prescription treatments. So our thinking is, well, maybe if you remind doctors that they've got alternatives that are prescription level alternatives to antibiotics that they'll substitute in for that. For instance, you can, if somebody comes in with a bad cough and you diagnose it as bronchitis, you can use albuterol, which is like an asthma inhaler, and that's something they can't get themselves, but it's not antibiotics. It's not going to contribute to this problem. So that's one thing we thought we would do, is we just sort of overcome that maybe lapse in their memory and nudge them in that way. The second thing that we did, and these were all done, manipulated independently in what we call a 2x2x2 design, is accountable justifications. So antibiotic prescription, if there was a non-bacterial diagnosis that the healthcare provider entered into the electronic health record system, and they also wanted to prescribe antibiotics, then an alert would pop up and it would say, okay, well, we noticed that you're prescribing antibiotics for a non-bacterial diagnosis. Can you please provide a brief justification why? Our thinking here is it would work behaviorally on a few different levels. On one level, it would sort of disrupt them from their normal workflow, and doctors tend to be myopically maybe sensitive to anything that's going to disrupt their workflow. And even though this takes maybe 30 seconds, that's a big deal to a busy clinician. Secondly, it's going to implicitly remind them of what the guidelines suggest, and implicitly introduce that as the default. I mean, all physicians know what the guidelines say. So you're kind of saying, okay, you're deviating from the norm, right? Third of all, and maybe most importantly, what it's doing is it's causing them to enter their justification into the electronic health record systems that can be read by other healthcare providers. It's part of the permanent record. So this not only holds a mirror up to the behavior, but it also introduces a process of social accountability, which we thought might deter them from violating the norm. Finally, the third condition was peer comparison. Here, all we did was once a month, we sent an email to all the healthcare providers. We said, in the last month, you've had this many non-bacterial infections, upper respiratory infections. You prescribed antibiotics this many times. And then we told them how their performance compared to the top performers in their region, the top decile of performance, which is usually close to 0% of the time inappropriately prescribing antibiotics. And we told them either you are a top performer or you're not a top performer. So we were using social norms to try and influence behavior there. Well, cutting to the chase, this is a paper that was published last year in JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association. And what you see here is you've got each of these. Here's the control condition. Everybody's going down, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. The accountable justification worked quite well. The peer comparison worked even better. The suggested alternative, you can see all of them worked in terms of after the intervention, which is the 0 timeline, prescription went down. You know, it started out in the kind of 30% range, which is actually better than national averages, which are closer to 50% of the time inappropriate antibiotic prescription. And by the end, in all of our interventions, you're in the sort of 5 to 10% range. So very successful. But the one question that arose afterwards is, well, why all the improvement in the control conditions? Why, maybe there's some sort of efforts going on outside of our study nationally to get people off the antibiotics. That certainly is true to some extent. But we thought there's something else that's missing here. And I'm going to get back to answering what that is in a little bit. The third puzzle in this literature has to do with organ donation. This may be the most famous choice architecture picture in this literature. How many of you have seen this picture before? Okay, a lot of you have. This was a study in 2003 that Eric Johnson and Dan Goldstein compiled. This picture is a picture of organ donation rates, or at least consent to be organ donor rates, in different European countries. And the interesting thing that happens in these different European countries is that some have an opt-in regime. For instance, in my home state of California, if you want to be an organ donor, should you meet your untimely demise, you put a dot on your driver's license, and that indicates have at it. In other countries, it's the opposite, where we presume that we can harvest your organs unless you tell us otherwise. What is it here in Australia? You don't even know. That's interesting. It's opt-in. Okay. So you see that different European countries with somewhat similar demographics have different regimes You can guess which is which, right? These are the opt-in and these are the opt-out. And take just, for example, Germany and Austria, which a lot of us would consider to be demographically similar and culturally similar. Germany, which is opt-in, has a 12% organ donation rate. Austria, which is opt-out, has a 99.98. Now, your grandmother might have told you that it would make a difference what the default is, but she wouldn't have guessed it would be that massive a difference. And so that's really interesting. And you might think, well, we can solve all the problems of organ donation just by going to opt-out. Here's another example, by the way, just as an aside, one of my favorite studies from last year where defaults were used to improve healthcare. This is by Malhotra and colleagues. One problem with spiraling costs of healthcare in America can be attributed to overprescription of drugs that are the branded version as opposed to the generic equivalents, which are usually exactly the same formula. But there's something about the brand equity that makes the original branded version seem safer. And most doctors are kind of biased to prescribe those. Most patients are biased to want them. And so the question was, well, what happens if when somebody enters in a branded drug like Wellbutrin, it automatically gives the generic equivalent, but you can opt out just by unclicking a box, or clicking a box here, turning it to dispense as written, right? What happens when you do that? Over the course of a single month in the clinics that were under observation, the rate of generic prescription went from 40% to 96%. Incredibly effective. And you can imagine how much money that could save in a healthcare system or insurer when done at scale. Okay, well, back to the organ donation. One interesting observation is that defaults don't always work. You think it would work always. It seems like it's one of the most robust things. But default effects sometimes don't work. In the case of organ donation in the year 2000, the Department of Motor Vehicles in the state of Virginia decided, well, we're opt-in right now. That's not a good thing. Let's change our regime. Maybe we're going to get greater organ donation. Now, they didn't quite have the guts to go from opt-in to opt-out. What they did was they went from opt-in to a forced choice. So they went from you indicating when you get your driver's license, I want to be a donor, which is optional, to forcing people to choose whether they want to be a donor, not want to be a donor, or decline to state. Well, guess what happened? They did this, everybody declined to state, a lot of people declined to state or said they didn't want to be a donor. In any case, the organ donation rates went down relative to what they'd seen before, which is you wouldn't have predicted if you'd been studying this literature, and so it had to be reversed. It was a failure. Why is that? So that's our third puzzle. Choice architecture 1.0, so here's, I guess I presented this already. People aren't necessarily rational. They construct their preferences. You can design environments to promote better decisions. Has a certain kind of agenda that it implies, research-wise and otherwise. You want to develop and apply some new behavioral insights. This has been the game for the last 10 years or so. You know, we know that things like Save More Tomorrow works. We know that not organ donation, but defaults tend to be a very potent way of inducing behavior. What else can we discover by studying the landscape of behavioral kinds of biases that we know about? So we develop and apply new behavioral insights. We apply old ideas in new field settings. You know, maybe the 1.1 enhancement, there are a couple of them. One of them might be, let's try and personalize our nudges to different people that might be differentially responsive to different approaches. Let's look for moderators. Let's try and customize our approach. I'll give you one example of what might moderate the degree of receptiveness to a nudge. This is a study that is part of a paper with Liat Hadar, former postdoc, and David Tannenbaum, who I mentioned before. What we did was we approached people on Amazon's Mechanical Turk, and in this case, we were looking at the effect of people's subjective level of knowledge, how confident they felt in their ability to choose, on how susceptible they would be to a choice architecture device, in this case defaults. And our hypothesis was that maybe people who felt more knowledgeable would be less susceptible. People who felt less knowledgeable would be looking for kind of a cue, what to follow, and be more nudgeable. But importantly, what we did was we didn't actually change people's actual level of knowledge, we just changed how confident they felt in their level of knowledge. And the way we did that was in the high subjective knowledge prime, we asked them, this was financial decisions people were making, so we asked them 3 really easy financial questions. And that made people feel confident, yeah, knowledgeable, right? And we've all had this experience. You take an easy test, you feel like you really know the area. You get a hard test and you don't feel like you know it at all. So the low subjective knowledge prime, we had them answer very, very difficult questions, which most of them got wrong. And then we had them choose between a REIT, which is a real estate investment trust, or an exchange-traded fund for investment in their 401k plan. And we randomly assigned the default, and we told them, in fact, that it was random. And here's what happened. In the high subjective knowledge condition, there was a default effect where the proportion of people choosing the REIT was higher if the REIT was the default than it wasn't the default. If we primed them to feel like they weren't very knowledgeable and feel less confident, they were even more susceptible in both directions to the default. So it's just one example of a 1.1 approach. Let's think about what factors moderate receptivity, and that may influence how we think about the psychology and how we design our choice architectures. Okay, so those are our puzzles. What happens when we go from 1.0 to 2.0? What's the key move here? Traditional approaches to choice architecture treat the choice architect as exogenous, outside the system. What I'm looking at is, I know some psychology or behavioral economics. I introduce a particular way of describing options or eliciting preferences or whatnot. And I take that as coming from the outside, and I look at how that influences people's behavior. What happens if we treat the choice architect as endogenous, as part of the system? But this is kind of like an implicit social interaction between me and the choice architect. I'm given a menu of options. I'm given some sort of an elicitation that causes me to make some choice concerning a policy. And I start to think about it not only just in terms of how it's being presented to me, but also why is it designed the way it is and by whom? I start to go through that sense-making process. How does that inform what I know about choice architecture? This suggests a new kind of agenda. Theoretically, choice architecture becomes a kind of a subset of what psychologists would call social cognition. Practically, it might help us explain and predict relative effectiveness across situations and individuals of different choice architecture regimes. And then there's sort of an interesting metascope that you can broaden the scope of study to study the behavior not only of the targets of choice architecture, but the choice architects themselves. If you think about the fact that we're all in different situations act as choice architects, whether formally or informally. Parents know what I'm talking about, right? With our children, if we want to nudge them to behave in a particular way, for instance. So that might be an interesting thing to do. So there are three implicit questions then that under 2.0 framework that are going on here. One is, what can I learn from the choice architect if I'm a target? Two, what will the choice architect learn about me? And then three, what will I learn about myself in relation to the choice architect? And let me kind of unpack these a little and give some examples of it to explain what I mean. Now would be a good time to break for a sip of water. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, what can I learn from the choice architect? Well, one thing that we're starting to learn from recent studies is that choice architecture, sometimes, in particular, a default, is sometimes viewed as an endorsement, an implicit endorsement from the choice architect. Why did they choose this as the default? Why is it the default that I, for instance, save for retirement by enrolling in a 401k plan? A lot of studies have showed that people seem to think that when I'm offered a set of choices, one of them is the default, I take it as an endorsement from the choice architect. 1/3 of 401k enrollees are influenced by that perceived endorsement, according to one study. But they think, should I enroll, should I not? Well, it's the default. I guess they think that's a good thing. It's the right thing to do. It turns out it's stronger for people who are less knowledgeable, consistent with the result that I presented to you from our laboratory studies. If I don't know what to do, then I have a stronger incentive, stronger motive to look for information in the choice architecture. For instance, what is the choice architect? What does my boss think? What does the government think is good for me? It's weaker for those who are less trusting of the policymaker. So for instance, if you're looking at federal policy and you're in a country where people don't, or a region of the country perhaps, where people don't trust the government, then you might think twice. You might actually have a reverse effect of a certain choice architecture, like a default, where people actually resist it more actively. So let's get back to why doesn't the option to save more later lead to higher response rates in that study that I showed you from Bashir's and colleagues before. We offer the delayed option to save more money that may have two counteracting effects. One is it leverages, as I mentioned before, a present bias, right? That I'm discounting the future heavily. That should lead more people to save more when you say, do you want to save more in the future? On the other hand, you may be signaling, if you say, do you want to save more now or do you want to save more in the future, you may be signaling the employer is not urgently recommending increasing your retirement savings, which would drive you in the other direction. Right? They're saying you can do more now or you can do more later. Well, I may as well do more later, since that's an option. And it turns out that in the original Save More Tomorrow program, the way it was designed, it was only the people who decided not to immediately enroll in 401k who were offered the option of saving more tomorrow. Whereas in the study that I showed you, in that study, everyone was offered that choice between now or later. So they did a follow-up laboratory experiment on Mechanical Turk where they said, okay, imagine the HR department's considering different mailings about retirement savings program. And they had them review different ones side by side, a standard delay versus no delay, a no delay versus a two-stage delay. Well, let me show you what the two-stage delay is. The two-stage delay is, yes, enroll me now, and if I don't do it now, then I get sent something that says, okay, well, do you want to do it in 6 months? So this is more like the Save More Tomorrow compared to the version where they're just choosing between now and in the future. The bottom line is, and I don't have the data actually, I don't have a picture for you to show, but I'll just tell you what the punchline is. The punchline is they found it made a difference. Everybody thought it would be more effective getting people to save for retirement to do the two-stage version, which is more like what Save More Tomorrow actually did than what they did in this field follow-up. So having this kind of choice architecture 2.0 framework, people are making inferences about what the choice architect thinks, and this implicit endorsement in this case may have an influence on my behavior, all of a sudden allows us to explain a critical moderator on when Save More Tomorrow is going to work and when a version that seems like it's different in an irrelevant way actually won't work. Because now it sensitizes us to the fact, we have to think about the signal we're sending from the choice architect as a function of how we design it. So what can I learn from the choice architect? Choice architecture also can reflect descriptive social norms, what's popular. And to give you a sense of this, I'll tell you about one thing that we did with the physicians and prescription. This is a study we did of physicians at Northwestern University's medical system. We had these practicing physicians who were quite experienced read vignettes about hypothetical patient cases. All of them were acute respiratory infections. Well, I don't expect you to read this. This is just a description about what the presenting symptoms are. But importantly, what we manipulated was just simply how we listed the options for prescription on the menu. In this case, cough lozenge, cough spray, cough syrup. These are non-prescription treatments. And then you've got prescription drugs that are grouped together. Albuterol inhaler, antibiotic, Robitussin, whatever this is, Tessalon, Perles. Okay. The manipulation was, did we group the aggressive treatments and list the more mild ones separately, or did we do it the other way around? And of course, we also counterbalanced the order in this experiment. And our thinking was, if you list something separately, what you're doing is you're sort of sending, either you're making it more salient, or maybe you're also making it seem like it's something that's more popular. Because otherwise, why would these be listed separately and these be grouped? So you're not really saying anything to people, but it might have an effect on the choices that are made. And indeed, this is what we found across a number of different vignettes. The thing to extract from this is almost all of these lines go down. And that is to say, when the aggressive treatments are listed individually, as opposed to as a group, you're much more likely to prescribe them. When the aggressive treatments are grouped together, now they're less salient, you're less likely to prescribe them. So here is an interesting new technique that arises from thinking about how choice architecture might be sending, people are making inferences from the choice architecture. In this case, we surmise it's about what is most popular. Overall, 20% decrease in aggressive treatment when they're grouped. Now, we were interested in the mechanisms, and in ongoing research, we've actually entertained at least a couple of possible mechanisms. One of them is, well, maybe what it is about salience. Maybe what it is about the more you think about an option, the more appealing it becomes, and more salient ones that are listed separately, you're more likely to kind of elaborate in your mind why this would be a good idea, whereas ones that are grouped together, not so much. So then we thought, well, how could we rule that out? One way to rule that out is you present to people negative options, bads. Because the salience argument would say, well, if I kind of elaborate on the bads, I'm going to like them less. So listing bads separately is going to make them less popular, right? If salience and mental elaboration is what's driving it. So we did it with household chores. We asked people, would you rather clean rain gutters, lawn mowing, weeding for an hour, or do you want to do a household chore, your choice of kitchen cleaning, vacuuming, washing, folding laundry, or we grouped it the other way around. So these were, some were household inside and some were outdoor chores, right? Bottom line is, I'm sorry, it's hard to see here, but the bottom line is what we found when we listed something separately is we actually, instead of decreasing attractiveness in the case of the bads, we actually increased the attractiveness once again. So that led, well, maybe what it is then is, as I say, descriptive social norms. A descriptive social norm is the assumption about the shared behavior of what most people do influences what people think is appropriate behavior, which social psychologists have known for a long time is the case. Maybe that's what's driving the effect in this context. So we did, for instance, studies where we gave people, again, grouped versus packed options for things involving entertainment, a hypothetical trip to Europe, place to go for the weekend, desserts, all kinds of things. And we replicated this effect that when things were unpacked or listed separately, they were more likely to be chosen. But we also asked them about their inferences. What do you think of the relative popularity of these things? And we found exactly the same effect. So simply listing them separately led people to say, oh yeah, I think it's more popular. And importantly, we also found that people's inferences statistically mediated their choices. So once again, returning to choice architecture 2.0, what it's suggesting is, here's another example of one of the inferences that people are making when they're a target of choice architecture. In this case, how are the items listed on a menu? How are they grouped? They make an inference about how popular they are, and that helps drive their choices. Something that would have been invisible under choice architecture 1.0. We wouldn't have really thought about that. Secondly, what does the choice architect learn about me? Now, it's been known for a long time that when you put a person into an experiment, there's a phenomenon we've known about for decades called Hawthorne effects. It's from some old industrial organizational psychology where you'd go into a company and you'd change some aspect of the work environment and look at the effect on productivity. Like, we make it brighter. Turns out people get more productive. You make it dimmer. Turns out people get more productive. It turns out that any change led to some positive difference in people's performance. And this observation has led us to, well, it's been called Hawthorne effects from the factory that it was originally done at. The observation is that when people know that they're a subject in an experiment or are being observed, it tends to raise their arousal or whatever, their attention. They tend to perform better in a lot of kinds of tasks. Psychologists worry when we design our studies about avoiding those kinds of effects because they can get in the way of the kinds of psychological interpretations that we have for behavior. But now in this context it may be kind of interesting that people actually, their behavior changes in this context. I mean, here's this puzzle I presented to you about antibiotic prescription. Even in the control condition we get improvement in performance over time. Now most of the time people would kind of shunt that away. It's an embarrassment. It's what we call a demand effect in the experiment. It just merely mean an experiment causes you to do better. I mean, that's why we have a control condition, so we can see if you do better still when you add the intervention on top. But when you think about it, if under the control condition where all we do is tell people you're in an experiment and at the end of the experiment you get down to 15% prescription rate, that's a lot more cost effective than monitoring the behavior, providing them feedback, changing the architecture of the electronic health record system. And in fact, I have a confession to make. This is the figure that appeared in the JAMA article last year, and it was mostly because something that some of the editors insisted in the way that we present the data, but what it's doing is it's smoothing what's going on from 18 months before we started to when we started to 18 months later. If you look at the original version that we submitted, it looks like this. This is the unsmoothed version. But I want you to notice that in the unsmoothed version, it becomes a lot more apparent that all the action happens right away. Not so much of a problem for our interventions, but look, even in the control condition. So people are going along here at about 40% inappropriate antibiotic prescription here. This is this top one here. This gray one is the control condition. All of a sudden you say, okay, you guys want to enter an experiment where we're going to observe your antibiotic prescribing? Sure, that's all. That's pretty much all we do. Boom, the prescription goes down to about 20%. So sometimes the artifact actually becomes the intervention. The interesting thing is maybe across a lot of situations we can influence people's behavior merely by telling them, okay, we're going to measure you. Is that okay? I'll tell you about another experiment just to give you a sense of it. Well, okay, here's the Hawthorne factory studies. But there's a study recently done by John List and some of his colleagues at the University of Chicago where they were trying to get airline pilots to make better decisions about, for instance, how much fuel to carry on an airline flight. If they carry too much, then the plane flies too heavy, it costs more because it's a heavier flight and so forth. So they thought, well, let's introduce a lot of kinds of incentives, right? We can have a control condition, we can, where they're in the study, we can tell them, we can give them feedback on their fuel consumption, we can give them targets, we can give them kind of behavioral interventions in various kinds. But here's what happened. All of the conditions worked. Another Hawthorne effect. You tell pilots, you're in a study, we're going to observe you. Yeah, you can add these bells and whistles. But pretty much everything worked at improving their performance. So once again, when you go from a 1.0 lens, where the choice architect is exogenous and all I care about is understanding the psychology, to a 2.0 lens on choice architecture, you think, well, let's think about what's going on in this implicit social interaction. All of a sudden it opens you up to say, you know, maybe actually the artifact isn't such a bad thing. In a lot of conditions we could use that as choice architecture to influence behavior in a positive way. Okay, what will the choice architect learn about me? Yeah, we see this in a lot of other kinds of situations, like Uriganese, University of California at San Diego, had a fun studies that he did in Israeli daycare, where they introduced a small fine if you're late for picking up kids. And what happened? According to economic theory, any sort of fine is bad. More people are going to pick up their kids on time. If the meter is running like a taxi, minute by minute they're late. In fact, when it was a big fine, yes, that works. When it's a small fine, people were late more often. Why? Because that bit of choice architecture, if you will, changes the way that I view the transaction. I'm no longer embarrassed about being late. Now it's just a cost of picking up my child late. So this can introduce some new lens on how we think about rewards and punishments as well. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about what will I learn about myself relative to the choice architect. Choice architecture, in some sense, could be seen as a threat to autonomy. You know, when I go from opt-in to forced choice, all of a sudden it feels coercive. And that coercion can lead to some reactance where I say, you know what, I don't even want to choose. I'm going to decline to state. There was a recent set of studies, still unpublished, by Jakimowicz and colleagues, including Elke Weber of Columbia University, where they allowed people to self-select defaults. You know, sometimes they had examples like you're building a house and your contractor says, okay, I'm going to default you into green appliances, right, environmentally friendly appliances, or brown ones that are cheaper but less environmentally friendly. People tended to diverge a lot from those defaults because it felt kind of coercive, and if they didn't have the choice. If they had the choice which one they go into, they're much less likely to diverge from those defaults. And some of their other studies seem to suggest that maybe that feeling of coercion seems to be driving a lot of these kinds of effects. The other thing that I'll draw your attention to is that your response to choice architecture can be sort of a self-signaling, what kind of a person I am. Or it could be signaling again to the choice architect who's observing. There are some studies that were done in which people would sign a form where they needed to be honest, either at the beginning of the form or at the bottom of the form. Like, I'm going to report my taxes correctly or not. If you put your signature at the beginning of the form, people are more likely to be honest than if you sign at the end of the form. Because all of a sudden I'm sort of self-signaling, yeah, I'm an honest person, and then I'm less likely to depart from it than if after being a little bit squishy, I sign. There's a study that was done recently by Eileen Chow in which what she did was she looked at electronic signatures. So electronic signatures are becoming increasingly important for commerce in general. Now that we don't actually sign in front of lawyers all the time important documents, we do a lot on the internet. So how do you establish that this really is the person who's signing over the internet? You have them sign electronically. But when you have them sign electronically, you have them do it in kind of a way that detaches their identity from the process of signing. Now I'm putting in maybe I put in some code number or something like that, and I see some electronic version of my signature go on. But it turns out that people tend to behave less well. They tend to adhere less to the terms of the contract and so forth if you use a standard electronic signature. And so what she was working at was, well, how can we improve this? And one way to improve it is get people to really personalize the code numbers and whatever that they use in the background of the electronic signatures. Something that's more personally meaningful to them now allows them to sort of distance themselves less from the electronic signature and may make them more likely to adhere to the terms of the contract. So this is stuff that's very much in progress still. Okay, so one last sort of question that one might ask in the context of choice architecture 2.0 is what's going to trigger this process of sense-making or social inference? We can start to hypothesize a few of them. One is uncertainty about my preferences, uncertainty about what's good for me, and so forth. And we've seen some indication of that when I feel less confident in my knowledge about to make a good decision, then I'm more likely to respond to some forms of choice architecture. Another one is change. If the regime changes, I'm used to signing a form in a particular way or being approached by a policymaker in a particular way, and all of a sudden the form changes. That might make me wake up and think, well, maybe I should think about what's going on. Why did they change this? Distrust of the choice architect. If I don't trust government or I don't trust my boss, then maybe I think, wait a minute, why are they offering it to me this way? And there's a lot of social psychology that suggests that when people distrust their counterpart, they tend to devalue things that are offered to them, concessions that are made in a negotiation in a similar way. If I distrust the choice architect, I might think, wait, why is that the default? And react against it. And there's some evidence that that is true. So those are a few things to think about there. What also I would suggest is something I said at the top of my talk, which is that we're all kind of imperfect choice architects. Whether we're acting as parents or managers or professionals, working with our clients, we all are in these kinds of situations where we have to make decisions about choice architecture. How am I going to present the options to people? How many options am I going to give people? Which one do I present first? Do I ask people to eliminate options or pick the one they like the most? Things like that, which we know can have a sometimes profound influence on people's choices. If we're imperfect choice architects, then maybe studying that imperfect behavior and where people can go do better and where they go wrong is an interesting topic of study under this 2.0 framework. Also, choice architects as a target of choice architecture. If I'm a top-level manager in a firm or a government and I'm trying to, I've got a bunch of formal or informal choice architects working underneath me, I might think, well, maybe I can influence them to make good decisions about the choice architecture they set up by having a kind of meta-choice architecture in place. And we can start to think about interactions in a multi-period game between the choice architect and the choice maker. And we can start to, and there's some folks who have started talking about that. This is all very new. But it opens up a new field of study. Of course, we can also talk about the acceptability of choice architecture. If we want to really broaden things and bring the choice architect into the circle of study, our field of vision, then we really ought to talk a lot about ethics and what we think is good choice architecture and evaluate the behavior of the choice architects. And I'll tell you something a little bit about that. This is a paper that I did with David Tannenbaum and Todd Rogers at the Kennedy School of Harvard. Basically what we did was we did a lot of studies where we wanted people to evaluate the acceptability of choice architecture. Well, maybe I should start with an anecdote just to motivate this. So back when the United States first put into place our social and behavioral sciences team, our nudge unit under the Obama White House, I was contacted by the head of the team, Maya Shankar, who wanted me to send out a solicitation to people on the mailing list of the Society for Judgment and Decision Making, which is this international community of decision making and judgment scholars. Adrian's a member, for instance. And I was president at the time, so I sent it out that the social and behavioral sciences team is looking for scholars to help contribute and collaborate on studies and so forth. It was, I don't know, about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. Somebody who was on that mailing list sent a copy of the solicitation to Fox News, which is a notoriously conservative, although by today's standards no longer ultra-conservative, but very conservative media gathering site. Anyway, there was a big tempest in a teapot because there was a big kind of media kerfuffle about how the Obama administration is trying to coerce you. And I made some innocuous remark to somebody about how they wouldn't have responded that way if the Obama White House was trying to use nudges to stop people from getting abortions or something like that. But that led to a kind of a more serious conversation about how we really need to distinguish the policy agenda from the policy methods and how we all have trouble doing that naturally. And so that led us to design a series of studies where we describe different kinds of choice architecture to people, and we ask them, how acceptable do you think this is? In a general sort of way, where we gave one illustration that was either a conservative illustration or a liberal illustration. And what we thought and what we found, and you don't really have to totally parse these pictures very well to get the gist of it, what we found was, guess what? When you use a liberal illustration, like automatically enrolling people into food stamp programs that poor people are eligible for, the liberals now say, oh yeah, automatic enrollment is a great general policy tool, and the conservatives say, automatic enrollment, not so good. It's very coercive, not a good thing. Whereas when you used your illustration as a traditionally kind of conservative illustration, like automatically enroll rich people into tax cuts that they're eligible for, but it can be used in lots of different kinds of ways. Now what do you think about automatic enrollment? Now the conservatives love it and the liberals hate it, compared to when you just give it no context or a neutral context. And that's essentially what these pictures are showing. We found it not only with M-Turkers, we did a version of it within a panel of US mayors, so even experienced choice architects, you could say, or at least policymakers, exhibited the bias. You can do it where you hold the policy constant. So the Pension Protection Act of 2006 in the United States was an endorsement for companies to automatically enroll employees into 401k programs and automatically escalate their contributions. So we told people either this was enforced by the Bush administration, or we told them it was enforced by the Obama administration. Both were true. Then we said, what do you think about this choice architecture? And the same kind of phenomenon happened. So it's an interesting area of study. Yes, there was a paper that was done, appeared in the first journal as I come to a close here. I promise you I'm about to come to a close. In the first article, first issue of the journal Behavioral Science and Policy that I edit, that Adrian was kind enough to mention, George Lowenstein and his colleagues looked at what happens if you're transparent with your nudges. You say, okay, well, maybe the ethical way to implement the nudges is tell people, hey guys, we just nudged you. Now, if you want to change your choice, you can. And they did some studies with, well, in particular, one big study in which they automatically enrolled people. They had a default, I should say, for end-of-life care, right? That advanced directive. Do you want to, prolong life, or do you want to focus on comfort? Should you get into a serious health condition late in life? And then after randomly assigning them to one of those defaults and having them make a choice, they said, by the way, we assigned you to a default, and that might have influenced your decision. Do you want to change? One of the kind of interesting things that came out of this was, at least in that brand of choice architecture, being transparent was okay because the choice architecture still worked, the default effect still held, even when people knew they were being nudged, they allowed themselves to be nudged. So again, something within this sort of 2.0 lens becomes a more salient and more interesting kind of topic of study. So there's our agenda. Think of choice architecture as social cognition, bring in more social psychology, for instance. As a practical level, try and explain and predict relative effectiveness across different situations, and meta, try and broaden the scope to study behavior of the choice architects and indeed even the ethicality of their behavior. The last thing I'll show you is I'll give you a pointer if you're interested in learning more about the Behavioral Policy Association. It's behavioralpolicy.org, spelled the American way, without the U. We have now published, we're about to put out our 4th issue of Behavioral Science and Policy, the journal that comes out twice a year. It's unique in that we have all papers go through a round of not only the usual kind of review from disciplinary editors, and we have a really top team of scholars, but also policy analysts. Look at every paper and provide feedback from a policymaker angle. Finally, all articles that are recommended for publication are worked over in collaboration with professional writing editors. So we try and make it the rigor of a top science journal meets the accessibility of a more friendly kind of journal like a Harvard Business Review, for instance, or a Scientific American. So I encourage you to go online and check it out. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any questions he allows me to take, given the time constraints. Thank you. Yes?
You touched on social norm.
On what?
Social norm?
Yeah.
And in the example of the doctors, you were comparing them against the decile of performing doctors.
Right.
In the 401k example, when we're trying to default members into the default investment plan, during that application process, would there be any value in saying, congratulations on choosing to default, 85% of participants choose this investment?
Certainly that would work. I mean, descriptive social norms have been used quite a lot in a lot of situations. Voting, for instance, if you tell people most people vote or most people like you vote, that's much more effective than saying, 25 million single women didn't vote in the last election. Imagine if all of them came together and had their votes be heard. The basic principle is that you want to marginalize rather than normalize undesirable behavior. And you want to normalize the desirable behavior. So pointing to a large proportion of people is a good thing. Now, there was one application of it that was done famously by Bob Cialdini and some of his students, including my colleague Noah Goldstein, where they were trying to get energy conservations. They put these hangers on doors in households in California where they'd read the energy meter and they would put on the hanger, okay, either you consumed more energy than your neighbors in the last month or you consumed less. Now, the good thing is those who'd consumed more, the subsequent month ended up consuming a lot less. They were responsive to the descriptive social norm. The bad news is the energy misers, the ones who'd been very green, actually backslid. Oh, I guess I can relax. I'm consuming less than my neighbors, right? So then they followed it up by supplementing the descriptive social norm with an injunctive social norm about what you should be doing. So all they did was, if the person was consuming less than their neighbors, they put a smiley face. Good going, right? If they were consuming more than their neighbors, they put a frowny face. And that was enough to keep the people in the green who are doing well from backsliding. When we designed the intervention for the antibiotics, and Noah Goldstein was one of my collaborators on that project, we were very aware of that problem, which is why we looked at the top decile. We also relied on the fact that doctors tend to be a very competitive lot. So we thought, okay, they're going to want to be in the top group. They're not just going to be average. And that ended up being quite successful for us. There was a kind of related version of this sort of thing that was done by members of the Behavioral Insights team around the same time as ours, totally independently. Not as successful as our intervention. I think it was published in Lancet last year, if I'm not mistaken. But they did a slightly different kind of intervention without the top decile. I think that's probably why it wasn't as successful, if memory serves. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, great. Anything else? Yeah.
I really appreciated all the examples that you provided of applied policy applications. I'm wondering, have you identified particular policy, say sectors or industries or spaces where behavioural insights hasn't yet ventured into, where there's promise but perhaps there are barriers to getting this?
What are you thinking?
I'm wondering, well, I mean...
I'm very bullish on applying behavioral insights, and I'm very broad in my thinking about what constitutes policy. The Behavioral Science and Policy Association is about not only public policy, but also private sector policy by organizations. I'm also aware of the fact that you can do well by doing good For instance, that Cialdini study that I just described with the social norms was used as the basis for a company called O-Power. Cialdini was actually on their board. Some guys, smart guy, enterprising guys, read the study and said, ooh, this is cool, we could build a business around it, selling these energy solutions to different cities and different companies and who are interested in reducing energy consumption. They were so successful that at one point they had a market capitalization of, they went public, they had a market cap of, I don't know, $600 million. It was ridiculous. And they've been very successful for themselves, but also at reducing energy consumption. So I think there are a lot of domains where there's a lot of potential to introduce behavioral insights to do good for society while doing well for businesses. And I think technology also introduces a lot of possibilities. All of us are wearing these activity trackers now. And so thinking about, and a lot of companies that actually create this technology are now hiring behavioral scientists to consult on what can we do with these data and what can we learn. It's a brave new world we're in. I have a colleague, since I'm being recorded, I shouldn't say. Let's just say he got access to a very interesting set of data involving tracking the movement of individuals. And when you think about tracking movement of individuals, you can learn a lot about where they live, where they work, what their habits are. And we all, kind of unknowingly sometimes, we're defaulted into allowing our data to be sold. So there are ethical issues about how you use it, but there are also some interesting issues about what we can learn about. Like one project he was talking about was, well, if we link this up with data on payday loans, we can learn where do people go after they get their payday loans. Or maybe that can be used in service to creating better policies. So I didn't really answer your question exactly, except to say I think it's becoming ubiquitous. We've seen a lot of it in financial decision making. Health, it's becoming big now. Energy and environment is becoming big. And I think education, it's starting to become bigger. And I think anywhere where, the reason I'm so high on it in a policy setting is any sort of policy is about behavior. And yet, for many, many decades, we've just had this very narrow lens of what constitutes how people behave and how they're going to respond. So we focus on incentives, information, and regulation, and that's it. And, doesn't it make sense to consult people who know something about human behavior if you're trying to design interventions that affect or rely on behavior of individuals? So you're going to cut it off. The shepherd's crook is coming out.
Yes. Thank you, Craig, for that.